Welcome to Charles Dickens' A Brain on Fire, a series that digs deep into the life and works of one of the greatest novelists of all time. Hi everyone. You will have just heard me declare Dickens as one of the greatest novelists of all time. You did not, however, hear me describe him as one of the greatest poets of all time, and you're about to find out why. Returning today to talk about their new publication, The Verse of Charles Dickens, published by University Press, are the inimitable Dr. Lydia Craig and Dr. Emily Middleton. This is a hugely enjoyable read that comprehensively, for the first time ever, gathers together all the known pieces of verse, or worse, as Sam Weller would call it, from notebooks, autograph albums, sheet music, and play scripts that Dickens wrote throughout his life. The ones he was proud of, and perhaps the ones he never wanted us to see. They paint a vivid picture of a lively, often self-mocking and silly wit that likes to entertain and flirt or pour scorn on a political party. Many of these writings are spontaneous, unrefined, while some are tortuously overworked. What they seem to highlight, perhaps, is Dickens's true genius as a prose poet, where that creative fire will flow from his subconscious, but how, when he consciously tries to manipulate a metrical form, he is constrained and his powers are dampened. Above all this, though, these snatches of verse show us what he must have been like as your friend, making you collapse in hysterics as he emulated his heroes in front of you. Lydia and Emily, hello and welcome back to Charles Dickens' A Brain on Fire.
Hi. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
We're going to be talking today about your latest joint publication, The Verse of Charles Dickens. Oh, yeah, there we go. Seeing it. The listeners can't see it, but there's a nice kind of sepia drawing. What is that drawing? What is that what I'm seeing?
I think it's a pencil portrait that was done of Dickens by Priscilla Horton. So she was an actress, and he was writing poetry in her autograph album. And so on one of the leaves of the autograph album, she drew him in that moment as the poet. So we thought it would be a really good cover image because, this is Dickens kind of hot and young and writing poetry, and it's just a very romantic kind of image. The beard isn't there yet, obviously. Yeah. He's really young.
There's something of Byron about it as well, isn't there? I think that it does have that sort of romantic, capital R, romantic poet look about it.
I think he's trying to do that as well, which is, I think the funny part of it is, when he was younger, he was very known for having this very flamboyant style. He had it throughout his life, but he was definitely doing the romantic kind of flowing hair, long sleeves. You see the sort of lace at his wrists when he's younger. So, yeah, Dickens wanting to be romantic, I think.
Yes, he looks very rakish. And I suppose in those early years, it just occurred to me, you saying this, that I guess he's probably searching for what he's going to do still a little bit. I know it involves writing, but actually, I suppose the option for poetry is possibly a window there that he thinks he might be able to, or a door he might be able to open. I do think the image does fail, though, if you do actually read some of the poems.
Oh, God. Are you okay after reading?
I have to say, I am so confused. I was at first kind of shocked at how bad I thought they were, actually. But I did wonder, how important are they to Dickens? And what did he make of them himself, do you think?
Well, I think that's a really good question. I think it's really interesting that Dickens writes poetry and plays before he writes prose fiction. So this is some of the earliest stuff that we have. And I've actually been teaching students this semester, teaching David Copperfield and scenes of love and romance in that. And I had them read his romantic poetry to Maria Beadnell as part of that. And that was fascinating because they were thinking about this kind of authentic young man in love experience. And I think those early poems really give us that. But he writes poetry across his whole career. There's some in just about every novel. It's something that he comes back to. But my opinion has always been that he's very stuck on his romantic influences. He's very limited by rhyme schemes. And he's always trying to emulate somebody.
Yeah. One of our actual sort of unofficial methods for telling if a poem was by Dickens before doing research was whether it was good or not. And if it was good, it couldn't be by Dickens. So he's not very good at this form, but it was such a popular form in his time period. And so I think when he first started writing poetry, I sort of mentioned this in the introduction a bit, but he was writing poetry to impress Mariah. Her family was very literary, very erudite, actually. And so in order to get in to her group and to write original poetry in her autograph album, I think he was reading poetry and studying forms. And at the time, Byron was still the great idol. So I think he sort of patterned himself on those people. But I think the fun thing about his poetry is that he's actually aware that he's not great at it. And there's that kind of sort of self-mocking quality to it that I think is essential to an understanding of Dickens, because, he's writing poetry, especially in his later years. He knows he's not good at it, but he's still going to inflict it on his friends because he knows they love him and they'll read it and it will be this sort of joke between them. So he uses poetry in a lot of different ways, I think. But he never, I would say, would have ever thought that he was a good poet. And he knew that.
Okay. It's important to know that, I think, isn't it? It's helpful to know. I did wonder, though, whether Mariah broke off their romance on the basis of those poems that he gave her.
Yeah, we were talking about this a little bit. We don't know what the circumstances were of him reciting this. People sort of think maybe it was at a dinner party. So all the people who were mentioned in the bill of fare could have heard what was being said. But we do know that he sent it to her ahead of time, because he sent her a letter that said, read this and pay attention to this section here where I declare my love, basically. So she did have advance warning.
And Charles Dickens, who in our feast plays a part, is a young summer cabbage without any heart. Not that he's heartless, but because, as folks say, he lost his a 12-month ago from last May.
But I do think it's really striking that we don't have evidence of any poems he ever sent to Catherine or to Ellen. So I think there is always that self-aware humour in it, and they're basically all funny. But even if it's a little bit kind of self-deprecating, even at the beginning, he seems to decide that it's not going to help an actual romance and doesn't do it again. So he does it with other women and a daughter of a friend who are friends of his, but not romantically after that first effort.
Except for that, the one poetry, I think it was the Ivy Green, which might have been slightly romantic, but it's dependent on the family that he wrote it for. They have this legend that he proposed to the woman whose album he wrote it for. So, but yeah, mostly I don't think he does a romantic thing again, unless it's a joke.
Fast he stealeth on, though he wears no wings, and a staunch old heart has he. How closely he twineth, how tight he clings to his friend, the huge oak tree. And slyly he traileth along the ground, and his leaves he gently waves, as he joyously hugs and crawleth round the rich mould of dead man's graves, creeping where grim death hath been. A rare old plant is the ivy green. It's so interesting because I'm so aware that from the novels he's aware of what bad poetry is. You've got Sam's Valentine card in Pickwick, and you've got the Ode to the Expiring Frog, and none of that's meant to be serious at all, is it? But at the same time, I always think as a writer, he's so generous with showing his workings out, in that he doesn't tend to refine himself quite as much as...
Yeah.
So maybe that's why the poetic form kind of stifles him a bit.
Yeah. I think we did also talk about this earlier, Emily. We were talking about how he just can't keep to the meter.
As the great rage just now is imitation, 'mong highborn and low throughout the whole nation. I trust 'twill excuse the few following lines, of which I'll say nothing but these poor rhymes.
Yeah, even though he writes in blank verse when he's doing prose, which people noticed in his own lifetime, I think prose let him be more expansive and lyrical if he wanted to be, but he found a lot of trouble, I think, actually expressing himself in the confines of the verse form.
Absolutely. I think that he felt like good poetry should rhyme, or he felt like his poetry should rhyme, but he did, as Lydia said, fall into blank verse when he was trying to be very sentimental. And this was pointed out to him, and he didn't like it. He didn't like someone pointing out that you could read his sentimental passages in a blank verse meter.
Yeah.
So I do sometimes wonder if he'd done a bit more of a sort of Tennyson narrative poem or something a bit more expansive, if it could have worked. But he seemed very stuck on the idea of what poetry should be, and it was almost always these rigid forms that didn't get the best out of it.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of fascinating to me that he did know so much about poetry. We sort of were looking at his career as an editor as well. And he often tells people what good poetry is, which usually doesn't have, wild metaphors. It needs to rhyme. It needs to be in meter. But he just himself, he admired Tennyson. He loved Tennyson, actually. He would read his works to people at home and really thought he was so incredible as a poet. Just not for Dickens.
but that moment, you're both talking about when he does drop into verse in his prose, in his, the ending of David Copperfield. I mean, that's very regular, isn't it? Oh, Agnes, oh, my soul, so may thy face be by me when I close my life, indeed. That is shatteringly beautiful where that falls. And the end of A Tale of Two Cities as well. It is a far, far better thing that I do than I have ever done. It is a far, far better rest that I go to than I have ever known. So there it's kind of working for him. But for some reason, as soon as he sits down to write something, it goes all Humpty Dumpty and sort of jarry, doesn't it? I don't know why.
I just think he had, it sounds so basic, but I think he had too many words. He loves adding words to something and making it really descriptive and just painting the scene. And that's not something you could easily do in poetry. I think Tennyson had a great gift for that. And Yeats and people like this have a gift in one or two lines of showing you an image. I don't think Dickens could do that in line. He needed a paragraph. And this isn't perhaps fair because there are times where he'll choose the right words and it just sort of hits you immediately. But I think in general, he needed to set the scene. And so a lot of his power is in showing you the environment, and it sort of builds up over several paragraphs. I'm thinking particularly of that, I think it's about one or two paragraphs in Our Mutual Friend, where he sets the scene of London covered in fog.
It was a foggy day in London, and the fog was heavy and dark. Animate London, with smarting eyes and irritated lungs, was blinking, wheezing, and choking. Inanimate London was a sooty spectre, divided in purpose between being visible and invisible, and so being wholly neither. Gaslights flared in the shops with a haggard and unblessed air, as knowing themselves to be night creatures that had no business abroad under the sun, while the sun itself, when it was for a few moments dimly indicated through circling eddies of fog, showed as if it had gone out and were collapsing flat and cold. Even in the surrounding country it was a foggy day, but there the fog was grey, whereas in London it was, at about the boundary line, dark yellow, and a little within it brown, and then browner, and then browner, until at the heart of the city, which calls St. Mary Axe, it was rusty black.
And what's really interesting is you could compare that to a poem I think he wrote where he mentions London covered in fog, and it just doesn't have the same impact in one line where he's deliberately paraphrasing that paragraph, I think.
Dark and grey it makes the day, o'er forest, dale, and down, prospect yellow, faces sallow, in London's gloomy town.
You just don't really see it the way you do in his novel.
But I feel like at this point of the podcast, everyone listening is going to think I'm never going to...
They feel betrayed. They've switched off. Yeah,
I'm not going to read any of Dickens's poetry. But one of the reasons that we structured the book chronologically is to show its development across his life and how he uses it in different places, and that it does show his immersion in different kinds of popular culture. That in Edwin Drood, one of the last ones he writes, it's a very silly little childhood playground song, a little bit like What's the Time, Mr. Wolf? So he's immersed in popular culture and songs and games. Lots of them are set to music, so there's a real musicality to it. It shows his relationships with women, but not just romantic ones, but flirty friendships as well. And there are some great political ones too, where he turns that humour and satire to a bit more effect. So I think in terms of making him immersed in a culture and a society and in relationships with people who are the wives of his friends, or just his friends in their own right, and showing how he was connected into all these things, as well as his interest in romantic poetry and what he thought poetry was. It's got real value, even if it's not necessarily got the poetic value that we might expect.
Yes, because Emily, the Fine Old English Gentleman, I think it's called, isn't it? I actually liked that one, because actually that had a bit of bite. That was satirising old Toryism, and all that. And I thought that was great, actually. I didn't think that was bad at all. I'll sing you a new ballad, and I'll warrant it first rate, of the days of that old gentleman who had that old estate, when they spent the public money at a bountiful old rate, on every mistress, pimp, and scamp at every noble gate, in the fine old English Tory times. Soon may they come again.
But it's based on another song, which I think is the funny thing. He's using a form from another poet. And so he's sort of fitting his own words to it, which he does, I think, tolerably well. So I would agree with you on that. I think it's one of his best political poems, because he's able to sort of show the folly of people voting for Toryism if they want a progressive society. And he's very, furious about this. So yeah, I think that's one of his best poems.
The good old times for cutting throats that cried out in their need. The good old times for hunting men who held their father's creed. The good old times when William Pitt, as all good men agreed, came down direct from paradise at more than railroad speed. Oh, the fine old English Tory times. When will they come again?
Yeah, I think because at that moment they had just elected a Tory government, right? And there were all these anxieties that he's harking back to of the 1820s. And I think his connection to people like Leigh Hunt, who was himself connected to Keats and Byron and all of that romantic circle, that Leigh Hunt was one of those people kind of referred to in the poem who had been locked up for saying something about the Prince of Wales, that he's sort of connecting that romantic past and present, that Leigh Hunt, as his friend, does really well, I think, connects him to that past. But whenever I talk about this, I always read that poem because its critique feels so present today, that sense of what is it that we're harking back to in those fine old English Tory times? What is it that we want to preserve? And why is it that that sense of conservatism ignores the scandals of the past while still glorifying it?
He's publishing this in the Examiner too, and he's trying to influence voters with this. And I think that is fascinating because he's doing poetry for a political purpose. So he's not doing the autograph albums anymore. It's not just, sending letters to people with a poem inside it. It's not private. It's extremely public. And the Examiner was not then under Leigh Hunt's editorship, but it still had that connection. And so he even mentions, I think, Leigh Hunt in his poem, this one. He says, those were the days for taxes and for war's infernal din, for scarcity of bread that fine old dowagers might win, for shutting men of letters up through iron bars to grin, because they didn't think the prince was altogether thin, which was actually what Leigh Hunt was put in prison for saying. So he's sort of, winking to the people reading this paper because they know about this history of Leigh Hunt. So he's very aware of his audience in this poem.
Does it kind of bring Dickens a little bit closer as a person, some of these poems? Do you see his failures, really? See what he can't do? Is there value in that?
I think there is. I think the difficulty comes with the fact that if he just wrote this poetry, we probably wouldn't be having this conversation. That there were plenty of people. We have letters where he rejects poems that people have submitted to his journals. So we don't discuss the poetry of many amateurs, but we do discuss Dickens's poetry. So I do think there's a value in, and you can see him attempting the construction. It feels like he's trying, where with his prose, it sometimes feels so effortless and it feels like it works, even though we know that Dickens was very hardworking. I feel like the mechanics are much more on display here, but we're primarily interested because it's Dickens, aren't we?
We wouldn't have made this if it wasn't Dickens, which I think is a really important thing to say. I actually sort of mentioned this in the introduction where I'm saying, he would not be in Westminster Abbey if this just depended on his poetry. He would be where he wanted to be buried in the first place in Rochester. So, yeah, this is bad poetry. I just kind of want to read one of them for you.
Go for it.
This is one of the worst ones. And actually, the funny thing about this is he sent this to John Hulla when he was doing The Village Coquettes in 1836. And he basically said, oh, I thought about this, basically thoughts in the bathtub. And here's this poem and you can work it into it. And we don't know what Hulla said, but I'm pretty sure it was just like, no, this would be morally wrong to put music to this. So this is in the Lord Chamberlain's copy, but it was never actually used. Okay, so this was a song that was supposed to be in Act 2, Scene 3. And it was supposed to be sung by the two women in the piece. He despises, he shuns me. The thunderbolt falls on the rock-seated castle and crumbles its walls. The whirlwind destroys with its furious breath. The lightning is charged with its mission of death. But the tempest that scatters my hopes in the air, more terrible far, bids me live and despair. He despises, he shuns me, there's guilt on my name. It drives me to madness, it brands me with shame.
Yeah.
That's it. I mean, I can't imagine what it would have been like, because nothing else in the play sounds like this. I don't know if it was supposed to be comic. We don't know, but it's just horrible.
Yeah. I mean, is it more plausible with music, some of this verse? Does it work better as song lyrics ever?
I definitely think that is true. And many of them were written to be set to music. Pretty much all the ones in the plays are. But other ones, like the Fine Old English Gentleman, was meant to have a sort of tune attached to it, and sometimes they did. And you've got to bear in mind that Victorians did like sentimentality, that people like Elizabeth Barrett Browning had been written off at some points in history for being too sentimental, and people have written defenses of sentimentality as a kind of affective strategy, that people like things that are sentimental. That is really bad, obviously. But some of the things
really well read. I was taken by it though, Lydia.
but even the ones that do make it in and the ones that do work, I don't think anyone would have been leaving the theatre thinking, oh, that was excellent. But I also don't necessarily think they would have been leaving the theatre thinking that this was absolutely in the pits, strikingly bad. I think it's just a kind of run of the mill.
Yeah.
Well, some of them were actually quite famous and popular. So some of them I think were hit or miss, but the others didn't make it, especially because they were made into sheet music. And so people could play them at home. They would be parts of collections. We also have George Augustus Sala's testimony about going to see the Village Coquettes. And he wrote about this in his memoir later, and he basically said that he can still remember the words to the tunes. And we do have the tunes in many cases. We obviously couldn't replicate that in a printed book, but you can look it up for yourself if you're musical. I played one of them, the Autumn Leaves one, which I think is just really kind of funny until you put it with the music, and then it sounds really beautiful. People are finding these catchy, not only because of his lyrics, but also Hulla's music. So I think it did fairly well in its time.
I understand that you both have been at separate locations examining manuscripts here, and I think, Emily, you discovered Cheer for the Year, and Lydia, you did My Uncle Toby's Sworn Oath in London and New York. What can you tell us about those particular ones, and holding the manuscripts? Was there anything kind of revealing? Were there lots of crossings out where it's like, I can't get this to work, or was he really fluent and sort of happy with what he was setting down?
So My Uncle Toby's Sworn Oath is actually one of his best manuscripts in terms of just the quality of his handwriting and the fact that there are no mistakes in it. And that's because he wrote it for an autograph album. I actually found this going through the New York Public Library's website because they had digitized it. And I couldn't believe I'd missed this. So this was called My Uncle Toby's Sworn Oath. It has his signature. It has a date. We know he wrote this when he was finishing the end of Little Dorrit, so in 1857. We know he was in Kent. We know he was at Waite's Hotel on this day. We don't know who he wrote it for because someone took it out of their autograph album and we just have the leaf. So there's still a mystery about who he wrote this for, but he seems very grumpy. And this is what he says. He wrote this on the 14th of April, 1857. And you have to read this thinking about his earlier autograph album poetry. He has been kind of a victim to his fame for years, writing in people's autograph albums. And someone cajoled him into doing this. And so he writes this and he says, My Uncle Toby swore an oath, and when the busy angel with the book and pen made haste to enter it, his heavenly grief blotted the word from the virgin leaf. I swore an oath that I would never rhyme in any album to the end of time. I wish the angel of this book would blot my oath's infraction from the present spot.
So he's not up for you two publishing this book, is he?
No, he would hate this.
On the strength of that.
So I think the thing is that we were doing a lot of this work during COVID, or during, at the very least, still ongoing travel restrictions. So there was a lot less actually being in the archives than we would like, and a lot more going through every library we could think of to see if they had something that said, like, an autograph album with a contribution from Dickens. And in at least one case, I contacted, I think it was Yale. They had one, brilliant. They sent me a copy of it, and it was just Autumn Leaves again.
Yeah.
We thought we'd found something no one else had ever found, and it was just Autumn Leaves again. He clearly liked that one. So Cheer for the Year was a new one that was at the Free Library of Philadelphia. And it's a really interesting one because, as I said before, we get with Dickens's poetry this sense of his friendships and flirty friendships, and particularly friendships with women. And this poem was written together with Mary Boyle, who was a friend of his, but also someone he acted in amateur dramatics with. So this poem was written, we kind of assume, drunkenly on New Year's Eve, 31st of December 1850, at Rockingham Castle, where the Watsons lived, where Dickens had been putting on Animal Magnetism, a play by Elizabeth Inchbald. And it's essentially what you might imagine some drunk friends writing to thank their hosts and celebrate the end of one year and the new year coming in. But it's collaboratively written.
Cheer for the year that's opening around us. Light may its shadows touch us as they fall. Peace and affection lovingly surround us. Cheer for our host and his old ancestral hall. Hope for the youthful, comfort for the aged. Heaven's gracious bounties plentifully pour, head, heart, and hand in godly works engaged. Green rest the present deck in memory's storeroom.
It really shows that kind of sociability and poetry as a kind of fun thing that you do with friends. And I once had somebody talk about Dickens say, is his poetry just doggerel? Basically, it's just, and it's kind of hard to say no. But on the other hand, he was very good at adapting it to particular people, to particular occasions, and making it feel personal and intimate and funny.
So, in terms of coming together, the two of you, to produce this, what were the steps that led you both to do this, to want to do this, and how long has it all taken?
This actually was not a plan at first. We've been working on a database called Dickens Search. And so we were putting this all together, and then we just kept finding new poetry that people hadn't seen before. And one thing we also discovered was there's so much confusion about what Dickens wrote and what Dickens didn't. You know, some people have set verse to music thinking that it's by Dickens, and it's just something that someone else wrote at the same time period. One of the worst ones that people usually do is by Charles Dickinson, who was an American poet and was very upset over the fact that everyone was always attributing this really fine poem to Dickens rather than himself. He even got a note from Dickens' son, Charles Dickens Jr., saying, "My dad didn't write this."
And I went to a Zoom performance of a poem that Dickens didn't write and had to tell the person who had set it in a lovely setting to music.
Academics. Right, come on.
We're always ruining everything. I feel like we need a t-shirt that says, actually.
I think you'll find. Yes.
I think you'll find.
Okay.
But the poetry, as much as, again, we've been kind of hammering home how bad it is, the fact that it has never been collected together properly is kind of astounding.
It's wild, too, because a lot of these, especially we have appendices, one of them has things that are reputed to be by Dickens. And a lot of that comes from people's reminiscences of Dickens. And they mention, oh, he wrote me this poem. Or, you know, I heard this in a play that he did, and they repeat it from memory. And at least in one case, I have the actual poem to compare it to, and it's very close, but there's some mistakes. So we know that they're not recalling it perfectly because that's not something that humans always do very well. But they're remembering something. And so a lot of this is sort of, it's so scattered. A lot of the actual manuscripts are in the US, they're in Texas or New York or Boston or Philadelphia, and obviously in the UK as well, but they're everywhere. I'm sure there's more out there though. So.
Yes, and if anyone finds any, let us know.
Let us know. I feel like this is encouraging forgers, so there's also...
But there's one poem, I think, that captures what you were saying really well about poems that are really ephemeral, and we only have somebody's account of the poem. So did you maybe want to talk about, because it's one of my favorites, I think, for this sense that Dickens is never beyond his influences, but also was funny and was able to do it all very quickly, which is the lines to EP after Byron, written on a window shutter.
Sorry, what? On a window shutter?
Yes. This was written by Eleanor Emma Picken, and she actually has two versions because she shared her reminiscences of Dickens twice in two different articles. We went with the first one.
So you have kind of essentially good folios and bad quartos.
Yeah. But yeah, the first one was usually what we went with, which is kind of obviously an editorial choice. But this was written for Eleanor Emma Picken. Dickens definitely had a crush on her. That's the woman that he held in the water as she was...
Oh, yeah. Ruined her dress. Yeah.
Yeah. And then she got married and he was apparently grumpy about that, which is so strange. But anyway, this is what happened. So she said, one morning at his own house, Dickens was talking on art to a gentleman present, and they discussed the statue of Venus, which Byron raves about in his pilgrimage. Dickens objected to the expression used by Byron, quote, dazed and drunk with beauty, quote, the heart reels with its fullness, end quote, as being an unpoetical metaphor, and said it must have been written tipsily under the influence of that beverage, gin and water, which sometimes inspired this great poet. I defended the verse, and Dickens rose up, pushed his hands through his flowing locks so as to give them their most weird look, turned down his shirt collar, slapped his brow, and exclaimed in the Bombastes Furioso style, "Stand back! I am suddenly seized with a divine afflatus. Don't disturb me till I have given birth to my grand conceptions." He took out his pencil, and finding there was no paper in the room, he stalked with grotesquely melodramatic air to the window and wrote on the white shutter. Afterwards, Fred Dickens, who was Dickens's brother, copied these lines and gave them to me the same day as Dickens had tried to rub them out. So Fred Dickens comes to the rescue, writes this on a piece of paper. And so these are the lines. "O maiden of the amber-dropping hair, may I, Byronically, thy praises utter? Drunk with thy beauty, tell me, may I dare to sing thy paeans borne upon a shutter?" So he's making fun of carrying bodies on a shutter, which people would sometimes do, but he's also written it on the shutter. So it's bearing his verse.
No, I like it. Actually. That's good. Once I have that context, I've got more time for it.
I really like it because I think it shows how quick he was because he was looking for paper. He didn't know he was going to write it on a shutter. So he came up with that. Like, it's not brilliant poetry, but it does show that he's quick-witted, that he's funny. And I think also the whole setting up of the story about what is and what isn't a poetical metaphor is showing what Dickens thinks poetry is and what it should be. And that in itself is really interesting to me.
Yes, He knows what it should be. He can't always do that, but he knows what it shouldn't be as well, which I think is also part of the joke. And he tried to get rid of it. He didn't leave it to posterity. It's just the fact, again, that he's so famous. His brother is going behind him, taking these drops of wit and giving them to people because he knows they want this memory of Dickens. He wrote them a poem. This woman obviously has a crush on Dickens and would like to have this memorabilia. It's funny, though, because sometimes we can actually see Dickens trying to keep us from seeing this. And I feel like the Daily Mail. But yes, it's so funny to think that we're actually doing something that he would hate. And I have some mixed ethical feelings about that. But
well, that is interesting, isn't it? I mean, it's a bit like if you could uncover a trove of letters to Ellen Ternan that you thought would gone forever, buried somewhere. I mean, how would you feel? What do you do about that, really? I mean, what can you do?
Yeah, it's tricky. I think this is a humanities question because I know Emily and I have dealt with this sometimes in our career in different ways as kind of, we're scavengers. We're going through people's mail. I'm working on another project right now where we're about to find out something about Dickens and, he would not have wanted us to know this. And, it's in the interests of truth in some ways to put it out there so people can see. One thing I've kind of dealt with in some of my own research is the fact that Dickens might not want us to know about something, but because his reputation is so powerful in how we interpret the 19th century, sometimes showing the good, the bad, and the ugly, I think is really important in a historical sense. I would be very sad if people went through my things the way that I'm going through Dickens's. So again, there is that ethical question. I try to be as fair as possible in my research and look at other sides and that kind of thing. And I'm sure Emily has similar thoughts about this.
Yeah, well, there's a great story that Dickens met a woman who had a manuscript of one of his plays and he traded it away. So he gave her a better manuscript of one of his novels because he didn't want it. He didn't want that to be in circulation, basically. My PhD back in the day was about biographies of Dickens and Dickens's legacy. And I think what Lydia says about that sense of reputation and hagiography, basically, that some people put Dickens on such a pedestal that it's helpful to show that this is a three-dimensional person, that he did not treat his wife well, but at one point he was a romantic young man writing bad poetry. He does have friendships with women, which are quite interesting social things. And if we just ignore the bad about Dickens or don't bring these things to light, then we're at risk of making him into some kind of two-dimensional hero. And lots of his family and people that knew him tried to make that happen. That was an active project to bury the bad. So I think the passage of time makes these things feel better. He did die quite a long time ago now. Yeah. So I don't really believe in that present damage. But as Lydia says, it's not something we necessarily want for ourselves, is it? For somebody to go through all of our correspondence and draw conclusions about what kind of people we are from them. So.
Definitely not. And I think that's the thing. Dickens was a human being with maybe more than usual pressures on him because of all the scrutiny and all the stuff. So it's not that I make excuses for him, but I also sort of see the wisdom of learning the truth sometimes about a public figure, just not in a cruel way, but just to know this is a human.
Yeah. But also just to bring it back to his writing, I mean, I feel like, reading your book, just really understanding his power as a prose poet, rather than, in all sincerity, because I think, when he subliminally goes there, and it starts to get a bit metrical and verse-like, and then it fades away again, it comes in so powerfully. But of course, when he constrains himself and he's too self-conscious about it, he loses his kind of powers, which I find really interesting.
One of the better ones is Song of the Month that he writes after Mary Hogarth dies. I think that one, actually, the way it uses meter, it's still sentimental, but that one for me works. So that's definitely one to read.
I stood by a young girl's grave last night. Beautiful, innocent, pure and bright, who in the bloom of her summer's pride and all its loveliness drooped and died.
But he is the great dabbler, isn't he? Whenever I teach something like Oliver Twist, I call it a glorious mess because it starts as this high satirical style and then it goes into something else and it's Newgate novel and it's melodrama. And in prose, you can move between those different things in a paragraph. But in the poems, he dabbles, but I don't think he ever spends enough time on it to get particularly good at it. But with the prose, you can see him working through that process, and there's glimmers of brilliance even when it doesn't fully come together in places. But he makes it his own. He gets beyond those influences. He doesn't get stuck on what it should be. And it is the great form of the 19th century, like serialization and the increased availability of cheap print like that. The fact that he published poetry in newspapers and made the most of cheap available print to get people to read these things. He never published the fancy poetry book that was associated with people like Tennyson and Barrett Browning and things like that. He was very much kind of the people in this, I think. And it was more about its resonance with his friends and the person it was addressed to than some great poetic project.
Right.
Oh, gosh. Well, I've enjoyed this so much. Thank you so much for talking to me about the verse of Charles Dickens. A link to purchase is in the description, people listening. So I hope you really enjoyed it. It's so fascinating to read.
Thanks for having us on.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Charles Dickens' A Brain on Fire. If you're enjoying these episodes and would like to make a small donation towards the costs of producing them, please follow the link at the bottom of the description and you can make a donation there. Every coffee you buy makes a huge difference. Thank you ever so much and see you next time.